Hello. Today we're going to compare the AFL and the CFL, Australian Football League, Canadian Football League. I think they're two similar leagues, so I'm just going to go through the details of why I think so. First off, what is Australian football? It's a game that's only played in Australia. It goes way back to 1859. It's played on fields that are similar in size to cricket fields. And it's similar to rugby in that they don't wear any protective gear. 18 players on the field, oval ball, oval field. And you take the ball and you put it through posts at the end of the field. Canadian football, very similar to American football, but it's different and it has a different history to it. And the first game was played only 2 years after that of the Australian football. And for the most part, both sports are only played in their own countries. It's a similar shaped ball, except with the Canadian football, it's got laces on it, whereas the Australian ball doesn't. And there's 12 players on the field per team. You take the ball and you try and get it down to the other end. Similar idea in the sports. And you compare the countries. The history to them both come from the Commonwealth. Canada's got a bit larger population, but their GDP per capita is about the same, though Australians drink more per capita than Canadians, which I think plays into sports as well. The more beer you drink, the more likely you're going to like sports. And you compare the leagues. AFL, established back in 1896, and it was originally known as the Victoria Football League. The CFL was a merger between two different leagues, but one of the leagues goes back to 1907, which was the Eastern League. Both have big championship games, which are huge events in their respective countries. In Australia, it's the Grand Final, first held in 1898, and in Canada, it's the Grey Cup, first held in 1907. So they both started around the same time. So the AFL, they have 18 teams, and CFL's got 9. So they have twice as many teams in Australia, and they play 23 games in Australia, and it's actually 18 in Canada. The oldest team in Australia is from 1858. That's Melbourne. Oldest team in Canada is Toronto Argonauts from 1873, and it's the #1 sport in Australia, whereas in Canada it's #2 or #3, depending on the city that you're in. Now let's look at the teams in Australia, and most teams are in the Melbourne area. There's 9 in Melbourne and 1 just outside of Melbourne in Geelong. And most of these teams actually share stadiums. So in Melbourne, there's 2 or 3 stadiums that all those teams play in, and they do play outside of their main cities. They do exhibition games in like the Northern Territory, Tasmania, New Zealand, and China. Now the Canadian football, it's very spread out across the entire country, and there's no team that shares a stadium with each other unless it's of a different sport. There is a plan to put a team in Halifax, which will truly make the league coast to coast. Attendance. The average attendance in AFL is 35,000, and the average attendance in CFL is just about 23,000. And yes, and the grand finals, the Grey Cup, they play in huge stadiums in Australia. And in Canada, they're kind of limited in the size. So 35,000 is pretty well the average stadium size in Canada, and they play the final in a different city every year, whereas in Australia, they play in Melbourne every year, and that stadium holds over 100,000. So they get 100,000 people every year for their final. In Canada, the record attendance is just shy of 70,000, and I believe that was in Montreal, because the Olympic Stadium hosts about that many. There's a stadium in Edmonton that holds just above 60,000, and their total games played with all the teams combined would be 207 in Australia and 81 in Canada. Now ticket prices, this one was hard for me to find for both leagues. Single game tickets, you're looking at a high price in Canada, $98 per game, and a low price of $32. And they have all these different tiers of where you can sit and prices in between there. In Australia, it was really hard for me to find ticket prices for single games. So I saw on the AFL website you could get general admission tickets, $27 for adults, and it goes down for concession in juniors. And I have a chart here of a playoff ticket from many years ago. I believe this is 2013, and it shows the price breakdown of places you want to sit in the Melbourne cricket grounds. Now, season ticket memberships, now this is where it got really interesting for Australia as opposed to the CFL. CFL, you can buy a season ticket package and it covers the full season, or you can get flex packs where you get to divvy out the tickets of which games you want to go to, or you get small packs. In Australia, there's more options available. You can get the similar packages that you get with the CFL, but say you live in Melbourne and you're a fan of a team, you can get a package that includes all games that are played in Melbourne, whether they're home and away, and I thought those packages were pretty cool. And say you're outside the state, say you live in Western Australia, but you're a fan of a team in Melbourne, you can buy a special pack that includes games in your state as well as a bunch that are in Melbourne if you travel out there often enough. League salaries, so these are per team. So Australia, it's just shy of $13 million, and Canadian football is just over $5 million. And the average salary in Australia is $362,000, and Canadian it's $115,000. Highest paid is 1.3. I forget that player, but that's pretty good salary there. And the highest paid in the CFL is $500,000. And at the low end, this is where it gets more similar, where it's $105,000 in Australia, $65,000 Canadian. And the dollars are pretty well on par with each other. International and exhibition play. So Australia Football League, they play yearly in China. They play a game, I believe it's in Shanghai. And previously they've played league matches in New Zealand. Exhibition matches have been played in all sorts of different countries. UK, South Africa, Japan, Greece, Singapore, India, the United Arab Emirates, and the States. They've actually played in CFL stadiums in Canada, in Vancouver and Toronto, and their record attendance outside of Australia is in BC Place in Vancouver, where the CFL actually has a team. In Canada, it's not as interesting. They are talking about playing in Mexico, but we'll see if that will happen. Previously, they've had teams in the US. Back in the 90s, they did a big expansion where the league was actually on par with the size of AFL. So they had a bunch of teams in the US, but for whatever reason they pulled back. Maybe that'll be a different video. They do play exhibition and league matches in some non-market cities where they're trying to test the market, see how that will do. That's how they've played in Halifax and Moncton, and they're looking to expand and put another team there. Now, this is women in professional sport here. This is where the AFL is really ahead of the CFL, because CFL, there's not really a women's league anywhere. And this will be another video about, in Canada, there's not really professional sports for women. And I believe Canada's really behind on that, but I'll talk about that in a different video, mostly regarding hockey. But in Australia, they have a women's league of AFL, Australian football, with 14 teams. Now the teams are all owned by the men's clubs, but the pay is okay, pretty good for women's sport. It's always improving around the world. And there's a per club salary of $576,000 in 2020, and it's going to raise up as the years go on. And that's in comparison to the 13 million for the men's club. It's behind, but their attendances are also behind the revenue that they generate. But hopefully that will improve in the future, and the salaries range from $16,000 to $30,000. In conclusion, the leagues are very similar in history, domestic-only appeal, as well as price. The AFL is, of course, bigger, but I believe that's mostly due to their stature in Australia. They are the #1 sport, and the CFL has to compete with hockey and soccer. So that explains why they are smaller. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see what other videos I can put out. Let me know in the comment section if I missed anything that I should talk about, or what I should talk about in future videos. Thank you.